Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins-Treworgy, also known as Baron of Sidious. For today's Storyteller's Corner, I'm going to be reading aloud for you my review of an interesting novel, The Fisherman by John Langan. I'm going to be reading from my handwritten notes and observations. This is going to be a slightly curious case in terms of review because I am intending to do a follow-up video to delve more in depth into some spoiler territory in a second video to follow this one. This one will simply be the standardized review that I tend to produce when doing these things. So look forward to that secondary portion in the near future. The Fisherman by John Langan, a review. As some of you familiar with me by now know, I am a fan indeed of the macabre, the bizarre, the creepy, and just downright weird. I'm often on the hunt for book recommendations in horror and weird fiction, as well as fantasy. And a couple of weeks ago, one such recommendation that was given to me was John Langan's novel, The Fisherman. This book is my first experience with Langan's writing, and I will go ahead and say without reservation that, based on my impressions from this book, I intend to track down more of his offerings. Certainly, this work is deserving of praise, and we'll get into the breakdown here in a moment, but first, a brief sidebar, specifically kind of for the folks on Substack. I don't always rip through books at the pace some of my colleagues seem to expect, or in some instances, practically demand of folks who are also themselves writers. Typically speaking, a book that is of middling to longer word count or page count takes me about 10 to 14 days to get through between family, work, and other duties, pursuits, and obligations. I bring this up because there's been a budding elitism/snobbery on the rise among my peers on Substack surrounding this subject. And my stance on the, quote, you should read X books per year, after all, I can do it, and I've got blah-de-blah-de-blah, what's your excuse? My response to that is as follows. Bite me. My pace as a reader is my business. With that unpleasantness out of the way, let's dive into the synopsis for John Langan's The Fisherman. Meet Abraham, or Abe as he goes by. Abe has a tale to tell us, a weird one for sure. It is a tale of loss, of power, and of the consequences when men driven to despair try to dabble in realms beyond normal mortal comprehension. And in part thanks to Langan's structural motifs and choices, it is a story about stories in its own way. Abe is a man rent by the loss of his wife Marie, who passed after only a few years of marriage, a victim of breast cancer. His suffering was borne nobly, however, and though he clarifies that their time together as husband and wife was marked by the decline of her condition, his telling of their time together is threaded with deep adoration and joy. Working at IBM in New York State, near the Catskills, he discovers a form of relief in fishing after much time in the depths of grief, a malaise that saw him turn into an alcoholic husk of himself. With a new sense of stability and routine, he returns to work where he meets Dan. Dan's a decent, if quiet man. Prudent, efficient, and capable, he proves a decent coworker. One day, Dan doesn't show up to work, which is notable, given his usual punctuality and dependability. Abe and the others at IBM learned that Dan was in a horrible car accident, one that took the lives of his wife, Sophie, and his twin sons, Jonas and Jacob. Dan himself survived, thrown from the vehicle and gifted horrible scars. When he finally returns to work, he is a hollow echo of himself. Understanding his colleague's torment in loss, Abe reaches out to invite Dan to go fishing with him, and a quiet kinship bond is formed. The pair become regular fishing buddies, engaged in a form of male bonding that is not only timeless, but serves for these two particular gentlemen as a form of therapeutic practice, a hobby to form an order to their day-to-day lives. Eventually, Dan suggests they fish a new spot, Dutchman's Creek. Not regularly marked on any public map, they head toward a diner that they have routinely haunted when going to other fishing spots in the area. The atmosphere of this outing is dense and brooding. There's a hell of a storm kicked up, and Howard, the diner's proprietor and cook, blanches notably when they tell him where they're headed. For the middle third of the book, Howard spellbinds them with the legend of Dutchman's Creek, a legend which lends a glimpse into some of Abe's earlier hinted-at foreshadowing, which lays the groundwork for putting the last third of Abe's narrative into a working frame of reference, and is, by itself, an enchanting tale. To avoid spoilers for now, I will note that having a firm grasp of the middle portion of this work is essential to get the most out of the back end. Additionally, understanding a broader scope of mythologies is supremely helpful if one wants to get the most mileage out of Langan's The Fisherman. I'll get into all of that in the post-review section of this piece, which will actually be another video altogether. With all of that out of the way, let's now get into the mechanical breakdown. Characters, 9 out of 10. In any given novel that utilizes first-person perspective for the narrative voice, it is almost a given that the narrator will be a fully fleshed-out person in fictional form. Abe, our narrator, is a well-fleshed, three-dimensional figure, granted tremendous depth by Langan's word choice, tone, and style. What's impressive here in The Fisherman is how rich and vibrant the rest of the principal cast is made, even when using Abe as the tale's narrative cipher. From Dan to Howard to the titular fisherman to Rayner and his eventual son-in-law Jacob, the primary and even main supporting cast of this work are all beautifully rendered for readers, and done so without having to pad out an enormous word or page count. Langan's mastery of character work is no small feat in this novel, and deserving of high praise. Plot, 7 out of 10. While it is true that The Fisherman is a layered tale, centered on the grieving process and the madness one can be driven to because of it, most plot points turn on Lost throughout the book. It is also a story about stories, about the unfathomable mysteries of the arcane and mystical. The fact that the character of Rayner is a philologist, one who studies stories, cultures, and literature in order to gain perspective on how those forms of culture and history interact and interplay with one another, is clever on Langan's part as well. There are facets and tropes of cosmic or weird horror within this book, and they are well executed overall. My lone major quibble with its deployment stems from a kind of formulaic approach to the plot, one that will be familiar to fans of cosmic or weird fiction. The plot also does drag a little in the middle act, but still remains compelling. World-building mechanics, 8 out of 10. Put simply, Langan crafts the boundaries of everyday life in grief and the establishment of legend and lore so cleanly that one can barely tell where the edge of the mundane is, and that is a priority in a tale such as The Fisherman. Technique/narrative voice, 10 out of 10. It is exceedingly rare for me to mark any of my 5 primary breakdown categories a perfect 10 out of 10. But when it does happen, it's for good cause. John Langan absolutely drives the nail through on a single swing with his narrative hammer technique and voice in The Fisherman, weaving a powerful tone of awe and humanity while losing not a single ounce of either elemental frame throughout the work. Even when relaying the tale of a tale told in the middle act of the book, one cannot help but be captivated by the story he tells and how he does it. Pacing, 6 out of 10. Every story has its weak point, sadly, and as masterful a display of storytelling chops as The Fisherman is for Langan, This is that area of weakness for him. It doesn't break the work by any means, but there are passages of Abe's tale that get a little navel-gazy, and the depth of the second act of the book does, in its own way, pull the reader in a kind of whipsaw away from what came prior in the first act of the book. Time bends and stretches a few times in both the first and second, and yes, even a little in the third act, and it's not always done smoothly. If we tote up our calculation, however, we come to a total of 40 points divvied up over the 5 categories to lend us an 8 mathematically. Conclusion. For the uninitiated in the arena of weird fiction or cosmic horror, a novel like The Fisherman will work as a brilliant entry point to the genres. For veterans of these sorts of tales, this novel will undoubtedly scratch the itch if seeking something in the vein of Lovecraft, Chambers, or Straub. It is superbly well written without being excessively verbose or loquacious, which works even further to the benefit of the narrator's authenticity of character. Mathematically, this novel ticks in at an 8 out of 10, but there are points I avoided thus far to stay spoiler-free up until this point, and those points for me would edge this into the territory of a 9 out of 10. This is a solid purchase recommendation for me, whether you're a weird fiction or weird horror fan or not. If the review and or recommendation is all you're here for, and I imagine that is, because that's going to be the end of this video, but I do want to say before concluding and saying goodbye that I did spend some time watching/listening to some other reviews of this book and looking up reviews on Goodreads and on Reddit and looking for any kind of inklings in other literary magazines and publications regarding a review and analysis of this work. For my liking, a lot of them sort of miss some of the points. One of the best breakdowns I read was actually on Reddit, which surprises me because I don't usually give that site much credence. But they almost all, universally, from my perspective, make the same mistake. And that mistake is not necessarily one that comes from a lack of understanding or intellectual capability. So many of the reviews you'll find call this work a piece of Lovecraftian fiction. They are wrong. It goes back further than that. And I'll explain what I mean by that in the follow-up, in the part 2 to this review video. If you don't want to be spoiled, you don't have to worry about it, and don't bother with the video that comes afterwards. I will be stepping into spoiler territories in the follow-up to this. But if you do want to know what I'm talking about and why I would say those reviews, they got it wrong. This is not Lovecraftian in that it doesn't connect to the Cthulhu mythos. There's something older than that here. Something that I found fascinating. And we'll get to that in the follow-up to this. For now, though, I would have to say The Fisherman by John Langan is a solid purchase recommendation from yours truly. And I would say just enjoy this work. I imagine you will if you enjoy a good tale. That's all for now for me, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.